So hi, and thank you everybody for being here at this conference and at this session, which I think really gets down to brass tacks of, about how do we transform energy as part of transforming our economy and our ecology. This is really where the rubber hits the road. And this subject matter was really pretty new to me. I don't have decades of experience here like the other panelists, and it's really wonderful to be hearing this, so I'm being definitely educated as we go. But recently I was invited to go to Norway as part of the effort of the Green Party in Norway to try to rein in their national oil company. So this has been sort of a very recent introduction, but I want to start just by addressing that last question that Charles raised about, sort of who does the oil belong to? And, is it fair to tax it? Is it fair to socialize it, et cetera? Because I think there's something intuitive about, claiming that this national, planetary, international scarce resource, by definition, who does it belong to? Is this something to be profited by and benefit only a very small portion of the population, or is there an argument here that these kinds of scarce resources, or even plentiful resources like solar and wind, that they inherently belong in the public domain? And I was looking around on the internet just to see, so who's addressed kind of that fundamental philosophical question, and one person, of course, is Martin Luther King, who said, in his last speech to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, he said this quote, "Why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising questions about the economic system, about a broader question of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy, and I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We're called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come up to see an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." And then he goes on to say, "So you must ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water?" These are questions that must be asked. And, I thought, great to, make that point. Who does the oil belong to anyhow? And in Norway is now one of the wealthiest, countries in the world, thanks to its oil. And its oil was only discovered in the early 70s, and there was all this oil coming from off the coast of Norway, so they decided, well, let's, in the tradition of a good socialist country, let's make this a national resource. So they founded a private company, but which was owned by the government of Norway in 1972, called Statoil. And its goal was, sort of consistent with the times, to just use that resource and make it a benefit to the economy of Norway. They were not sort of thinking renewable energy at the time, or the impacts of oil. They were just going after the money. That company was then privatized in the early 2000s to where there's a shared ownership, but the government of Norway still owns about 2/3 of it. So they have an enormous controlling share. However, they choose not to exercise their control, and it's run strictly for the purpose of generating maximum profit. They are now the 9th largest oil company in the world, and they are the 48th largest company of all companies around the world. And they are expanding, far beyond the shores of Norway. They're into the Gulf of Mexico. They are a major investor in Canadian tar sands, and they are partnering with Russia's oil company. Actually, I'm not sure which one, but it is a Russian company, in order to get oil out of the Arctic. And in doing that, they are violating their own code for what they're allowed to do in Norway. In Norway, you cannot dig for oil under snow or ice. That's sort of their, some of their ecological safeguards. But partnering with Russia, they're going by Russia's lack of safeguards, and they are in turn providing the financing that Russia could never do. So they're enabling, the devastation of the Arctic. So there is a big pushback going on in Norway, and actually Norway is interested in our help. I should say the people, the Green Party, the nonprofits, the environmental sector, makes the point that Statoil is very sensitive to international opinion, and there is a website which is complicated. I'll just tell you, if you Google Statoil, which is just S-T-A-T, like as in state, oil, and Arctic oil, you'll get a petition. It's sort of a letter to the, the Prime Minister to exercise their influence and not go into the Arctic. There's a similar campaign to get Statoil out of the tar sands. So if you Google that, you can sign it and spread the word. We'll try to put out an email about that eventually as well, so you can just blast that around to your contacts and to see if we can help them. But there's a broad coalition now of World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, the Green Party, the Community of Faith, and so on, that are working to try to rein in this national oil company and to socialize it and democratize it and specifically get it out of oil entirely and instead use its expertise in, in maritime and marine science to basically construct wind and to just move over from fossil fuels to renewables. So it's a long-term campaign, but as you know, we don't have very much time to do it for all the reasons that Len was talking about. Being in Norway made me realize how far we have come in just the last couple of years as we've been hit by superstorms. The public has not yet sort of converged on what we're supposed to do. For the propaganda of the oil industry has everything to do with that, but we are feeling the impacts. People get that climate change is happening, and by large majorities now support really substantive action to do something about it. In Norway, they're not there at all. They don't get it. Even though they're very progressive and pride themselves on being clean and having a clean oil company, they don't get climate change because they haven't been hit by it yet. So, and they are doing things like plunging into the ocean once a week, even during the winter. These young people are just jumping into the water to make the point and get the press and so on, and part of their campaign. So in contrast to Norway, which is sort of the problem, I just want to say a quick word about part of the counterexample, which is actually going on right now. In my home state of Massachusetts, we have 41 municipal utilities. We had legislation about a century ago that enabled any town to set up a municipal utility, but starting, I think, in 1926, the investor-owned utilities got a law passed that puts them in charge. So you cannot now in Massachusetts start up your own municipal utility unless you get the permission of these, these giant investor-owned monopolies. So effectively, all public control, the growth of public control over the energy sector has ground to a halt. And there's been a 12-year campaign to pass a new bill to override that, so-called MAMEC, the Massachusetts Alliance for Municipal Electricity Choice. They regularly come in 20 to 40% under cost of the private electricity providers. So it's far more efficient, it delivers at lower cost, it provides far better service. So when we've been hit by big storms, including an ice storm in 2008, where in the middle of winter, hundreds of thousands of homes were down. It took about 2 weeks for the investor-owned utilities to get the wires back up, but it took 2 days for the municipal utilities to get working again. And also it's been the municipal utilities that have been very interested in these questions of, about renewable energy. And so they've gone there, and they've established wind towers. And that's been part of the move to renewable energy in Massachusetts. It's been driven by the publicly owned municipal utilities. So the last point I want to mention real quickly is just on the issue of health. As Len had mentioned, so there's this community ownership and management model, and part of it comes from Cuba in terms of healthcare. I just want to mention one other thing, which isn't so much about energy ownership, but just the health benefits of clean renewable energy. And again, this goes back to Cuba, because when Cuba's oil pipeline went down in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly Cuba needed a new source of energy, had to totally change their agriculture and their transportation. So you would have thought their economy is basically, in complete turmoil. Their GDP goes way down. They're in crisis. You'd think people would have been very stressed out and that you would see that in terms of their health. But what actually happened was they had an incredible health renaissance, because suddenly, they were eating local, fresh, organic food, largely plant-based, riding their bikes and walking, and they didn't have air pollution. So what do you think happened? Their rates of diabetes, and all this was within a 5-year period. So people say, oh, it will take generations to change our health. Actually, it happens like that. And there are a whole lot of other studies that document this as well. But we have in this country a $3 trillion a year sick care system. That's 3 times the cost of the military security industrial complex. 3 times that cost we're spending on sick care, yet 80% of sick care could be prevented if we were just doing the right things up front, like converting to clean renewable energy and creating the jobs that go with it. So in Cuba, 50% decline in obesity, 50% decline in the death rate from diabetes, which is astounding. We can't do that with any medication here in this country, and even with the best health care. We don't even come close. A 30% decline in deaths from heart attacks, and a 20% decline in deaths from strokes. And this didn't even catalog the reductions in cancer and things like that, because that has a longer lead time. But, this is astounding. These chronic diseases that we consider just a part of the human condition, suddenly they were disappearing, even with a short reprieve, getting away from toxic fossil fuels. So with that, I'll end and just say there are so many benefits here to moving to fossil fuels, so sooner the better.
Always a pleasure to follow Jill, and inspiring message. I hope I can live up to that. Trade unions for energy democracy. I want to tell you a little bit about it, but I want to sort of also give some context to help understand why it's now. First of all, looking at it historically, unions, this is a global project, not a US-based project. Unions around the world have many different traditions, but there's a deep tradition committed to economic democracy. Many union activists and leaders a century and a half ago, or even before, pretty quickly reached the understanding that trade unionism can only go so far, that really it is a struggle about economic control, ownership and control of the means of production, in the case of unions from the socialist and Marxist tradition. From the more social democratic tradition, it was a question of at least having certain basic services under public control, certain strategic industries under public control, even if public control was not wall-to-wall or complete. So there was always this tension within the labor movements of the world, but at least there was an acceptance that the public ownership was necessary in many cases. Beginning around 1980, that tradition has been largely buried by, we know the historical developments, collapse of the Soviet Union, the decline of social democracy, and unions went along with pragmatic accommodations, fought often against privatization, but in most instances failed. So the belief was that issue of economic control was gone, historically gone, and we had to make the best of what we got, which wasn't a lot. So I just want you to keep that in mind if you're not aware of that history. Many are, of course. But trade unions for energy democracy, why now? It's because we're really in a different situation. First of all, we have, on the global scale, a massive increase in the use of fossil fuels. Let the myth of peak oil, peak coal, and peak gas be buried forever. This is not a world that is starved of fossil fuels. There are 1 trillion tons of economically viable coal on the planet, just waiting. Now, it's hard to get to. Yes, tar oil is difficult to get to. Shale gas is difficult to get to. Coal, in many instances, is difficult to get to. But when you've got the most lucrative industry in the world with all the best technology, they will find a way, and they are finding a way to get to it. So let's please not think that the climate crisis will be solved by peak whatever, because it won't, at least in my assessment of the evidence. Secondly, unions, workers are under attack. They're under attack in all sectors. But in the energy sector, globally, it's particularly violent. You've probably heard about the story of miners in Mexico when the mine exploded. 70 bodies they didn't even bother to recover the bodies. They just closed up the mine, and the families are still trying to get the bodies out. You had the massacre in Kazakhstan recently of 12 oil workers who died and many others injured. You've had the Maracana massacre in South Africa. The industry is a violent industry to its workers. Even in the United States, they locked out the Utility Workers Union here in New York City for Con Edison, locked them out, then brought them back to work under a reduced contract, a worse contract, and then Sandy hits. So they were already working 7 days a week for making up for the work that wasn't done when they were locked out. Then they have to work 7 days a week, sometimes 12, 14 hours a day, in order to deal with the emergency posed by Sandy. So here's a union that was one of the first ones to sign up for trade unions for energy democracy, because they understand that disinvestment in human infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure is of chronic and critical proportions right now. A couple of other quick points. Energy poverty. 1.6 billion people in the world still do not have access to a reliable supply of electricity. That's not going to happen if we leave things business as usual. Climate change. We talked today, and it doesn't need repeating by me, about the technical potential of renewable energy. Whether it be more centralized or decentralized, we can debate another time. But the technical potential is there to be 100% renewable energy by 2030 or 2040, and we would knock a big hole in the problems of climate change if we could get to that point. But we're not going to get there if we don't own and control the energy systems, energy resources, energy infrastructure, energy choices. Now, some unions realize that we are in a period of political failure and policy failure. First of all, we've talked about business as usual scenarios. The International Energy Agency says if we carry on the way we're going, it's 6% Celsius global warming. For a conservative organization to call that catastrophic, we should all take note. And unions are beginning to take note of that. But just as worrying, perhaps, is the new policy scenario that was put out by the International Energy Agency, which says if all of the policies that governments have committed to were implemented, that is, emissions reductions in some cases under the Copenhagen Accord, renewable energy standards, carbon pricing in some cases, if you put all of those things together, we're still looking at 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, and by 2035, fossil fuels will make up 75% of the world's energy consumption. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the fact that the current energy transition that was talked about with such enthusiasm several years ago is not happening. That emissions continue to rise, fossil fuels continue to come online in more extreme and violent forms. And the IEA said, the International Energy Agency, also warned in its last report, that the 450 parts per million scenario, which is the absolute minimum carbon can be at, many now believe, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that 350 parts per million is more accurate or more necessary, but 450 parts per million, that scenario would require no more physical infrastructure in fossil fuels in 5 years, by 2017, 4 years. And if we continue to build the infrastructure, we lock in carbon, because then you would have to basically have to retire new infrastructure long before it's worn out, and that would make the costs and the political acceptance of reducing emissions even more difficult. So the energy transition that's so crucial to the future of humanity is not happening. It certainly requires, therefore, that measures that were considered to be politically off the agenda need to be back on the agenda quickly, and that's beginning to happen. On renewable energy, I'm not going to disagree with Charlie about the role of a carbon tax. I don't know enough about it, but what I'm seeing, what I think we all see, is the policy of pricing carbon, certainly through a cap and trade system, is also in severe crisis right now. Most of you probably know what's happening with the European Union emissions trading scheme. It's not only politically dead, it's just not functioning. 2.5 euros per ton is not a solution to climate change. What it is a minor irritation for fossil fuel and other emitters who then write the check reluctantly. But it really is just a cost, and it's not even a very big cost right now. And so there's all the talk that was 5 years ago that we were going to phase this in over time, that it was going to be, the cap was going to be adjusted over time in a way that could drive innovation in industry. That discussion looks painfully tired and inadequate right now, based on what's happening in the European Union. The carbon tax in Australia at 23 Australian dollars a tonne is pretty low and not having much of an effect, especially when Australia exports 80% of its energy anyway. It's not going to have much effect on Australian emissions. But that's a complicated question. But I think one of the things that unions are dealing with right now is the optimism of the green economy has faded to such a degree that the United Nations Environment Programme's happy talk about the green economy is no longer really considered to be credible. So I want to turn in my last few minutes to talk a little bit about the trade unions for energy democracy. In Rio de Janeiro last year, there was a trade union assembly in time for the Rio +20. And it was a very interesting development that I want to share with you. The trade union discourse on the green economy had largely been dominated by the United Nations Environment Programme. If you go back to the early 90s, when the Kyoto discussions were unfolding and people started to realize there was such a thing as global warming and we needed a global agreement, blah, 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 that was all going on. There were 3 trade unionists attended the talks at the COP, or COP 3. COP 4, there was 5. COP 6, there were 7. It went on like this. In other words, nobody in the labor movement paid climate change much interest. They were too busy fighting privatization, fighting cuts in the labor in living standards. They wasn't going to send anybody to this. Most people went from the unions, the few who went, mostly from Spain, I should add, went on their own dime. They took vacation time to represent their union. They were not encouraged to go. By the time we get to Copenhagen in COP15 in late 2009, there were 500 unions represented. There was a massive demonstration on the streets, supported by the unions, but not with the level of enthusiasm or participation that was necessary. It's important to add that point. But nevertheless, unions started to see that not only was the climate crisis needed to be addressed, but unions could, in the event of a green transition, get a seat at the table, establish some social dialogue and participation with employers, redefine capitalism in a way that sort of restored some of the power and prestige that they had in the post-war period and improve living standards for workers at the same time. That idea was appealing, but it didn't happen, and now the issues again of economic democracy are coming back into the discourse. Last October, Cornell Global Labor Institute, my little operation, convened after the Rio conversation. And I'll just back up quickly, because I only have a couple more minutes left. But what happened in Rio, I forgot to say, was that the United Nations Environment Programme position with the green investments and the green capitalists and the price on carbon position was pushed back by unions in Argentina, from the Andean region, from Brazil, from South Africa, and they said, we have to go back to the basic message of economic democracy. If we don't control the energy system, we are dead in the water as a civilization. And while we're at it, we should be controlling the banks as well. So it was a very, very radical departure from the usual kind of like, don't talk about nationalization. It was a completely different picture. The head of the International Trade Union Confederation, Sharon Burrow, a very good person, said, well, we're disagreeing. This is just language we're disagreeing on. We're all here for the same thing, jobs. And they just basically said, what planet are you on? We are challenging your perspective of a green capitalist transition. So we went back at Cornell, we convened a global trade union roundtable called Energy Emergency, Energy Transition. We pulled together unions from 17 countries, and then out of that came a discussion called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. We have about 20 unions involved, including quite high-level peak organizations. The unions that are most engaged at the moment are the National Union of Metal Workers from South Africa. They, incidentally, have just put down $109 million of their union's pension fund into building renewable energy cooperatives. So they are saying this is a way to build a union. You basically take over a piece of the energy production and you unionize it and you turn it into a cooperative. I mentioned the utility workers in the United States. The Canadian Union of Public Employees have supported this project. The Canadians, Communication, Energy and Paper Workers, this union represents workers in the tar sands. They are against the expansion of the tar sands. They are against the Keystone XL pipeline. They say, we know what it's like to have a fossil-based economy because our members, although they make their living in that industry, are being killed by that industry. In Argentina, the unions are leading the fight against fracking. The European Trade Union Confederation passed a resolution just a couple of weeks ago opposing fracking in Europe. The Scottish Trade Union Congress just 4 weeks ago called for the nationalisation of the energy industry in the UK, and so on. So I'll close with a piece of reading which I'd like to suggest with some modesty. I wrote a paper called Resist, Reclaim, Restructure. The paper is on Howie's website. It's there. It's also on Energy Democracy Initiative.org, the Energy Democracy's website. The 3 R's, resist, is to resist the extreme energy agenda and the fossil fuels corporation's political agenda. We have to fight projects like Keystone XL pipeline. Unions are beginning to oppose that, although some support it in the US, many oppose it around the world. Secondly, reclaim. What was once the public companies that still are very, very much a part of the energy scene are behaving like private corporations. This is true of Eskom in South Africa, Sinopec in China, Gazprom or whatever it is in Russia, and all the others, and we've heard about Statoil. So we need to reclaim the public mission of publicly owned companies. Restructure. We believe that decentralized power has the techno-logic behind it of a more democratic, a more responsive, a more efficient, and certainly a cleaner energy system. We need to get unions embedded in that so workers are properly represented in that system, but there's no technical reason why we can't have a zero carbon energy system and everybody has a supply of electricity within 20 or 30 years. Well, that's the vision. Now we need the strategy to make it happen. And obviously more than unions need to be involved in this struggle, so I hope everybody else can be part of the energy democracy movement. Thanks, Harry.